When common sense is not common, foolishness becomes fashionable and wisdom becomes rebellion. Common sense dies the day truth begins to offend comfort. For when people would rather be entertained than enlightened, reality becomes a stranger in its own house. When you hear the words common sense, what comes to your mind? Logic, reason, sound judgment, the very basics of survival. Yet, throughout history and even today, we find that common sense is often the rarest commodity. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the African story. A continent endowed with wealth beyond measure, yet trapped in poverty. A people filled with ingenuity, yet held down by systems designed to keep them in chains. The question now is, why? Why does what seems so obvious to us remain hidden in practice? Why does common sense, which should be universal, end up being so uncommon?
Strength of Africa TV presents.
In the line of life, fools wear the crown. Truth walks barefoot while lies ride through town. Echoes of reason fade in the storm. When common sense is no longer the norm. When common sense is not common. The light of truth grows dim, the blind lead the blind to ruin.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are at this moment. I'm your host, Adebayo Oladokun, and this is Strength of Africa TV, where truth meets courage, where the past is reawakened, and the future of the motherland is reclaimed. Today's episode is titled, Africa's Paradox, When Common Sense is Not Common. Let us unpack this. Common sense tells you that if you possess gold, diamonds, oil, and uranium, you should be rich. You should be the master of your destiny. Yet, in Africa, this simple logic has been turned upside down. Our wealth has become our curse. While Africa produces the raw materials that run the world, from smartphones to electric cars, the owners of the resources live in poverty. This is not rocket science. It is common sense that the one who owns the gold should not be the one starving. But in Africa, common sense is not common. Just look at the Niger Delta. The oil that flows from that region powers nations across the globe. Yet, the communities living there bathe in polluted water, breathe toxic fumes, and live in poverty. It is common sense that the people of the land should benefit from the land, but they do not. Foreign corporations take billions while locals struggle to find clean water. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is called the world's treasure chest. Cobalt, coltan, uranium. These are the ingredients vital for modern technology. Yet, the nation remains one of the poorest on earth. The wealth of the ground is now a cause for those above it, and the world pretends not to see the contradiction. It is common sense to say that when a people fight for independence, they should rule themselves with dignity. Yet, after the lowering of the colonial flag, we continue to obey the same masters, just under different names. The IMF, the World Bank, the multinational corporations. It is common sense that independence should mean freedom. But for Africa, independence was carefully designed to be an illusion. We traded chains of iron for chains of debt. Take Ghana in the 1980s as an example. When the IMF stepped in, structural adjustment programs were introduced. Farmers were forced to abandon subsistence crops for export crops. Public spending on earth and education was slashed, and the result? A population dependent on imports, a government trapped in foreign policy, and a people robbed of their basic security. This was not a failure of logic. It was the deliberate barrier of common sense. It is common sense that a nation should produce what it eats and eat what it produces. Yet, decades after independence, many African countries import basic foodstuffs, rice, wheat, even fish, despite having fertile soil, rivers, and young populations. We import because someone told us it was cheaper. Cheaper at what cost? Farmers lose their livelihoods. Youth migrate in despair. And our economies bleed foreign currency. Now, where is the common sense in that? In Nigeria, billions are spent every year importing rice, while vast fertile lands remain underutilized. In Senegal, fisheries are depleted because foreign companies haul away their catch. Yet, local fishermen stranded. Young men take to the seas, risking their lives to cross into Europe. Because their source of livelihood is gone. It is common sense to defend your economy, but that sense is not common. It is common sense that leaders should serve the people. But in Africa, too many leaders have turned service into selfishness. They become rulers instead of servants. They hoard the wealth, build palaces, send their children to foreign universities, and then preach sacrifice to the people. This is not just a failure of leadership. It is a rejection of common sense. Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe started with the promise of liberation, but greed and power addiction overshadowed its legacy. Many others followed the same path, leaders who came as saviors and left as dictators. And yet, the people, tired of change that brings no change, endure it. Look at our past. Patrice Lumumba stood before the world and declared that the Congo would be free. He spoke with the simple logic of a patriot, that a people must control their own resources. But what happened? He was silenced, assassinated, because his common sense threatened the uncommon greed of global powers. Thomas Sankara understood that borrowing from the West was a trap. He asked a simple question: how can you be free if you depend on others for your daily bread? His solution was straightforward: feed ourselves, rely on ourselves, respect ourselves. That is common sense. But he too was killed because his common sense exposed the lies of a system built on dependency. Even today, Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso speaks the same truth. He says, if we have resources, then let them benefit our people first. But the question is, will we listen? Or will we again bury common sense under the rubble of fear and foreign influence? Let us look at the African diaspora. Millions of Africans abroad send remittances home. Money that has become a lifeline for entire economies. Yet, common sense will dictate that these funds be invested strategically into sustainable industries, into infrastructure, into education. Instead, they are often absorbed into short-term consumption. Imagine if the African diaspora's resources were organized into a common fund to develop African enterprises. The impact will shake the very foundations of neo-colonial control. But again, common sense is not common. Some in the diaspora also become unwitting agents of the very system they escaped. They send back foreign values, not just foreign money. They sometimes reinforce the belief that everything good is foreign and everything local is inferior. This too is a rejection of common sense. Common sense is also about unity. Africa has 1.4 billion people, a market bigger than Europe, bigger than the United States. If we truly united economically, if we truly spoke with one voice politically, Africa would not be at the mercy of anyone, but instead, we remain divided along colonial borders, tribal affiliations, and petty jealousies. Even the African Union, which was supposed to be our shield, too often acts like a club of presidents, not a voice of the people. The recent struggles in the Sahel, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso show the power of unity. Alone, each nation is small and vulnerable. Together, they create a blood that cannot be easily bullied. This is common sense. And yet, others watch and hope they will fail, because if this idea of true African unity spreads, the world orders shift. Common sense is the quiet voice of conscience. When drowned out, chaos becomes culture. And in the noise of deceit, the simple wisdom of decency is forgotten. When common sense is rare, the absurd becomes sacred. Laws multiply to replace what morality once guided, and justice bends to the will of popular opinion. When common sense is not common, a society becomes clever enough to destroy itself, yet too blind to save itself. It is not that people cannot see, it is that they refuse to look beyond what flatters them. And in that refusal, the light of reason fades behind the shadow of pride. When common sense is not common, we build temples for fools and tear down monuments of wisdom. We honor those who speak louder and forget those who think deeper. Common sense is the wisdom of balance between knowing and doing, between hearing and understanding. And when that balance is lost, everything tilts into madness. When common sense is not common, truth is seen as dangerous and clarity is called arrogance. We teach our children to memorize facts, but not to recognize foolishness. And so, the world marches on. Brilliant but lost, informed but confused, loud but empty. So, my people, why is common sense not common? When common sense is not common, deception wears the crown of intelligence, and the simple truth is mocked as ignorance. In a world where thinking is rare, even silence sounds like wisdom. For the crowd has learned to follow noise and mistake it for knowledge. When common sense is no longer common, propaganda becomes gospel, and popularity replaces purpose. The educated forget that learning without wisdom is like light without direction, bright but blinding. It is not because Africans lack wisdom. It is because common sense has been systematically undermined by systems of manipulation. When education teaches you to memorize, not to think critically, you lose common sense. When religion is manipulated to make you believe poverty is holy and suffering is divine, you lose common sense. When media is controlled to feed you distractions instead of liberation, you lose common sense. The truth is, common sense is dangerous to the powers that be. Because if Africa wakes up to its common sense, the game is over. The system collapses. The chains break. My people, here is the hope. Common sense is not inherited. it is earned through the courage to question the obvious. But we live in an age where few dare to ask, because the questions that free us are the ones that offend us. Common sense can be revived, and it is already resurfacing in the minds of young Africans, in the rising consciousness of the diaspora, in the courage of new leaders who refuse to bow. It is in the songs of our artists, the words of our thinkers, the courage of our farmers who choose local seeds over foreign GMO packages. The challenge is to make common sense common again, to teach our children that self-reliance is not radical, it is natural. To teach our leaders that servanthood is not weakness, it is duty. To teach our people that unity is not a dream, it is a necessity. When common sense sleeps, confusion awaits to govern. And when the simple truth is ignored, the complex lie is celebrated. And so, as we draw to a close, remember this. For one, common sense is not common. The simplest questions hold the hardest answers. And until we learn to think again, we will keep building tomorrows on the mistakes of today. When common sense is not common, the world looks wise but lives foolish. Common sense says you do not leave your house unlocked for thieves to enter. So why should Africa leave our resources unguarded for the world to plunder? Common sense says you do not let an enemy teach your children. So why do we let foreign curricula shape our future? Common sense says you do not beg the same hand that beats you. So why do we continue to seek aid from those who drain us? If Africa can restore common sense to its rightful place, then we can restore our dignity. The day Africans begin to think, speak, and act in alignment with this simple truth, the continent will be unstoppable. And perhaps then, future generations will look back on us and wonder how we ever lived in a time when common sense was not common. I'm your host, Adebayo Oladokun, and this is Strength of Africa TV. If you found value in this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Deezer. Watch out for the next episode. You don't want to miss it. Until then, tell your own story, because Africa's future is written in African ink. Stay rooted, stay bold, stay African, and thank you for watching. See you in the next episode. Bye.
Yeah, in the line of life, fools wear the crown. Truth walks barefoot while lies right through town. Echoes of reason fade in the storm, when common sense is no longer the norm. When common sense is not common.